Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to come back to Fee and speak. I was just talking to Steve Horwitz in the back room before I came out, and this is either the 9th or 10th year since I was here as a student. It's either 2000 or 2001. Pete Leeson and I were students in the same seminar. Steve Horwitz, Pete Boettke, and Mario Rizzo were all faculty. So as long as we keep coming together, I'm always the relatively young one, which is a good thing. But back then it was much smaller because in this library there was a big conference table, which you can see in some of the pictures, and we all sat around the conference table. I think there was only 20, maybe 30 max. I'm pretty sure it was like 15 to 20 range for the students. So it's grown substantially. So it's always wonderful to come back now and get to share this experience with all of you. So just to kind of set up my talk today, here's the way to think about this. And what I'm hoping to do is just provide some broader context for what you've heard already and what you're going to hear after me when Pete Leeson talks about development, but also this evening when we have the round table, and then tomorrow. So I just want to put it in context. Keep in mind what Pete Boettke was talking to you about yesterday during his talk on transition, which is the movement or transition between institutions, economic institutions, political institutions, social and legal institutions. All right, keep in mind what he was talking about with economic calculation, which of course deals with how we allocate scarce resources among competing ends, and the institutional environment required for economic calculation, which of course goes back to Kerzner and Mises before him. So just that's the context. Keep that in mind. I'm going to be talking about some of the same issues. I'm going to try to extend them in different directions. And then Pete Leeson, after this, will be talking about economic development in general. So you'll see overlap between all three lectures, but they're not the same lecture. It's the same core themes extended in different directions. And one of the wonderful things about Austrian economics, in my view, is that it's not just backward looking. It's not just history of thought like some people tend to think. And of course, the history of thought is quite important to understand how the school evolved. But in order for the research program to move forward, we have to extend and apply the economic way of thinking and the Austrian method to new and interesting areas that are policy relevant. And that's what I've tried to do in my own work. I don't know if I'm successful or not, but that's what I've tried to do, is take these ideas from Mises, Hayek, Kerzner, and extend them to current events, basically, to understand what man can accomplish. And that leads me to my talk today, which is called The Fatal Conceit of Foreign Intervention. And as the title implies, it's based on Hayek's last book, The Fatal Conceit. And to motivate this, let me just give you this quote, which is from The Fatal Conceit. 1988 is the book. Hayek has this quote: "The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design." So I want you to keep this quote kind of in the back of your mind, because it's the overarching theme. We want to understand what we can accomplish, what we can design in helping other societies improve. We see lots of problems around the world in lots of different societies. And we have a pull, right? A lot of people have a pull to want to do something, to help other people, to improve the human condition. Right? You see things like Haiti, for instance, and what do people say? Well, we have to do something. We have to help these people. Well, maybe. That's one question. Should we or should we not? That's a normative question. But then assuming we should, we need to talk about constraints. Information constraints, knowledge constraints, political constraints. What actually can we accomplish? Assuming we have some kind of moral obligation to actually help other people around the world. And this is where I think Austrian economics can make one of its many contributions to current events. So please keep this in mind, this background quote. And again, this applies well beyond my lecture. This goes to many of the lectures you're hearing this week. And this is a core theme, by the way, throughout Hayek's writings. It's all about how people coordinate, how they coordinate actions in the institutional environment in which people are able to coordinate and achieve their desired ends. So what's the fatal conceit? Well, Hayek talked about this idea of the fatal conceit as being the assumption that basically man can design the world according to their desires. Think of a puppet master pulling strings. I think we should have less poverty over here, more equality, more equal distribution of resources, fewer business cycles, and we can go on and on. Right? The fatal conceit is the assumption that we can get those outcomes. We can accomplish what we want. And of course, what Hayek's ultimately pointing out is that this, in some fundamental sense, neglects the broad idea of constraints, the idea of knowledge constraints, information constraints, and political constraints. So what do I want to argue? I want to argue, and by the way, I should mention that as the subtitle of Hayek's book, The Errors of Socialism, implies, he was focused on socialism, right? What I want to talk about is how we can extend those same arguments Hayek was making in The Fatal Conceit to foreign interventions. So I'm going to present 5 parallels between the fatal conceit of socialism and the fatal conceit, what I call the fatal conceit of foreign intervention. And I want to talk about foreign intervention, and during the Q&A we can delve into specific ones. I am going to provide some examples to illustrate this, the logic of my argument. But I define foreign intervention in the broadest sense. Just think of it as the use of discretionary power by one government to solve perceived problems in other societies. Those perceived problems can vary greatly. It can be humanitarian type things, think about Haiti following the earthquake. It can be nation-building type missions, think about Iraq and Afghanistan. It can be development initiatives. So there's lots of different foreign interventions in other societies to solve perceived problems. And I purposely am keeping this broad to show you how we can apply these ideas in a broad context. And of course, then we can drill down on particular applications, particular interventions within the broad scope of my analysis. So what I want to do is present 5 parallels between the fatal conceit of socialism and the fatal conceit of foreign intervention. These overlap, they're related to each other, but I do think they're distinct categories, so I want to present them as such. The first, there is a gap between intentions and results. Good intentions do not necessarily lead to good results. Hayek pointed out that many socialists had the best of intentions. They wanted to improve the human condition. Yet he also pointed out that despite these good intentions, socialism as a system threatened the well-being of millions of people. And basically what Hayek was pointing out was 2 things. First of all, a variant of the knowledge problem. Now, how the knowledge problem has been discussed so far in the conference is this idea of, in an economic system, allocating scarce resources among competing ends. How do we know how to allocate things, right? And Hayek pointed out this idea of tacit knowledge of time and place, and this links back to the idea of economic calculation. But we can make that even broader, right? There's this gap between the know what and the know how. We know what, for instance, a free society looks like. If I went around and just said, look, give me 5 to 10 characteristics of a free society, I bet you we could reach some kind of consensus. We might disagree here and there, but I bet you we could come up with some broad categories. But just knowing what it looks like, having those general characteristics, by no means we know how, right? So we know what, know how to actually go about designing and implementing those institutions. That's the gap between the know what and the know how. It's basically a variant of the knowledge problem. Then there's political economy issues. All right, and this basically relates back to the concepts from public choice. Have they talked about public choice? No? Okay, here's a very brief primer in 30 seconds. Public choice is a subfield basically emerged in the economics profession in the 1950s, 1960s. And here was the idea. It came out of the broader subfield of public economics. At that time, there was what now we call a romantic view of government. The idea was that there is market failures. All right, compared to the neoclassical model, the market fails. We have unemployment, we have externalities, we have underprovision of public goods. All right, and so we need to fix it. Well, who's going to fix it? The government's going to fix it. All right, and the assumption at the time, this is where the romantic view of government comes from, is that government was perfect. It was treated as a perfect corrective. Well, guess what? An imperfect market, a perfect corrective, the ideal always wins. The ideal always beats the imperfect. So government was viewed as a solution to market failures. And what the public choice school of thought, or school emerged, said it was very straightforward, which was this. Look, we analyze private market behavior based on some core assumptions. Purposeful behavior, people act purposefully. We can say they're self-interested and that they pursue their goals, and they act rationally, right? Meaning that they weigh costs and benefits. But then somehow, when we shift from the realm of private interactions to public interactions, government, we assume that away. We assume that they're benevolent and they're all-knowing. Well, that's kind of a weird assumption. What is it? All of a sudden, imperfect private individuals get elected to office and they become saintly and all-knowing? No, that seems like an odd assumption. So what public choice scholars called for was a symmetry of assumptions. They said, look, if we're going to assume that in the private realm, people are self-interested, they respond to incentives, we must apply the same logic to political institutions. And this led to a whole field of inquiry about the application of economics to political institutions to understand the various knowledge and information constraints, as well as the cost benefits, the incentives generated by political institutions. Why does that matter for this? Again, let's say we know what we want to accomplish. I say we have a moral obligation to do X. I know exactly what I want to accomplish. I want to build a free market economy. I want to establish private property rights, constraints on government, and so on. Well, even assuming we know how to go about doing that, which is a big if, then you have to make sure that there are incentives in place such that those who are implementing those reforms actually have an incentive to do what you want them to do. And as I'll talk about momentarily in the case of bureaucracy, oftentimes that's not the case. So when we combine these two things, the fundamental knowledge of how to accomplish what we want to accomplish, and then the perverse incentives created by political institutions, there is good reason to be skeptical about our ability to accomplish many interventions. Second parallel is the reliance on experts. All right, central planning, socialism relied on a central planning board, a group of experts that would decide how to allocate resources. What is the World Bank, the IMF, USAID, the various development banks for each country? They're just a group of experts who attempt to design a central plan that is then implemented to cure the various ills that plague societies around the world. Why does this matter? Well, again, you can go back to the idea of the knowledge problem. The fatal conceit at its core assumes, that way of thinking assumes that if you get the right people in the room, the smart people, that you can solve the world's problems. That's at the core of the assumption. I'm going to give you some specific examples of this in a few moments. All right, so what does this do? It neglects this idea of emergent institutions, or what I called spontaneous order. Institutions that basically emerge through purposeful human action, but not through some grand design. Human action, not through human design. It completely neglects those, and in place attempts to implement the plan of experts. Now, as Pete Leeson will discuss, there's lots of rhetoric flying around. If you read the government's various development reports, it talks about community development and local initiatives and buy-in and ownership. These all sound very nice, but if you actually peel back and look at what's happening, it's the same exact stuff, which is there's some group of people coming up with some plan that they think will fix the problems that plague societies around the world. Number three, which is related, is this idea of progress and development as a purely technological problem. It's this view. How many of you have heard things like the following? Well, we sent a man to the moon, therefore we can do X. Right? People love saying this. Politicians say it all the time. Right? Audience members, when I give this talk, say it all the time. Right? They say, well, we sent a man to the moon. Surely we can help people in Iraq. Or surely we can rebuild Haiti. And it's like, well, guess what? I've looked at a lot of the documents on Afghanistan. I haven't seen anything about sending a spaceship from Afghanistan. We could probably do that. Right? That's not part of the plan. The plan is to what? Rebuild an entire society. But it's this view that it's a problem. It's a mathematical or scientific type problem. And if we just get the right people, again, engineers, really smart people, people with PhDs, right? Because when you get a PhD, you understand how to fix the whole world. Which is another point, by the way. One of the powerful things about Austrian economics is if you truly internalize it, you realize that economics is a very humbling discipline. Precisely because it puts constraints on utopias. That Hayek quote. It tells you, look, there's limits on what we can design. So it's a very humbling discipline, which is the exact opposite of how most people tend to treat it. All right, so it's this idea of a purely technological problem to be solved. So what does this mean? Right people, right resources, more money. Right? What happened in Iraq when things started going badly? Everyone said there wasn't enough planning. If we had more planning and better resources, everything would have been different. Perfect example of this. It was just the argument was, well, if you would just let our group of people plan it, and if we just allocated the resources slightly differently according to our plan, we would have gotten a very different outcome. Perhaps that's one alternative hypothesis. Well, another alternative is that we actually can't centrally plan entire societies. So no matter who did the planning, it wouldn't have worked. But that's not one we really saw entertained in the debate on these things. Parallel 4. Bureaucracy. Central planning, socialism relied on a massive bureaucratic apparatus to implement the plans of the experts. So the experts design a plan, they need some way to implement it. How do they do it? Government bureaus, government agencies. Think about economic development today. Who implements government development plans? Lots of different bureaus and sub-bureaus. Who's carrying out the reconstruction in Iraq and Afghanistan? Bureaus and other bureaus and sub-bureaus within that and subcontractors. Right? What's the problem here? Well, there's a couple problems. And I won't spend too much time. We can talk more about this during the Q&A, but this goes back to that public choice point, which is we need to think about the economics of bureaucracy. Here's a very basic example from the news recently. Did anyone see the report, I think it was a week or two ago, that of the funds that are going to the reconstruction of Iraq, 96% of them that can't be accounted for? Did anyone see this news report? Either they don't know where the money is or they have no paper trail. All right? Now, think about this. If you ran a business, what do you think would happen if 96% of your resources weren't accounted for? You're like, I don't know where they are. I'm not sure. Right? Now, you're laughing, right? Which you have to do to like keep from crying when you think about these things. But what's the problem here? Well, I want you to think about the incentives that bureaucracies face versus incentives that for-profit firms face, for instance. Firms are a type of bureaucracy. They're non-profit inside the firm, right? There's not markets inside the firm. It's a form of bureaucracy. If we think of bureaucracy as basically organization outside the market context, but firms, the broader firm itself acts within the market. Think about the incentives they face. Well, a for-profit firm benefits by making a profit, right? And there's various ways to make a profit, but one of them is by minimizing costs. If you can cut your costs, you make more money, get it in your pocket. And there's an incentive to do that. There's a continual incentive to reallocate resources such that you're minimizing waste. Of course, and understand this does not mean that waste doesn't exist and mistakes don't happen. They happen all the time. That's precisely why we like markets, because they are a corrective, a feedback mechanism to point out that waste to entrepreneurs. Now, what happens, who can tell me what happens if a government bureau, the Department of Education, goes back to Congress next year and says, we did a great job this year, we did everything we were supposed to, and we came in 10% under budget? What do you think will happen? Will they say, great job, you get to keep that 10%?
They give it back.
They give it back, and then what happens in the future? They get their budget cut, because what happens? They say, well, you can do the same stuff on less money, so why are we going to give you more? So there's a very perverse and odd logic facing government bureaucrats, which is why for-profit firms have a natural incentive to save resources, to minimize waste. Government bureaus have an incentive to spend everything, even if it's not spent wisely. Any of you who are ever operating a government bureau have experienced this. Even small things, like at West Virginia University one year we got a email saying like we were all getting new clocks in our office. I'm like, well, my clock operates fine. I don't really look at it because it's on Windows, right? And they're like, no, we got to like spend down our budget, so we're all getting like clocks, right? Or I'll get like emails at the end of the year from the library. Order books, right? Tell us what books you want because we have to spend down our library budget. And it's like, well, maybe, but why am I ordering books I don't want? I would have told you if I wanted them, but now you're just asking me for random things, right? I ordered Mises' book on bureaucracy, and I told him to read it. All right, so I'm done. Thank you. I can't. All right. So there's reliance on bureaucracy over markets. Collectivism over individualism. Pick up any USAID, United States Agency for International Development report. All right? The Millennium Development Goals being the latest example of this type of thinking. You'll see referrals to national plans, global plans, national public good, global public good. Very rarely do you find any reference to individuals, to individual entrepreneurship, to individual initiative. And it's the same exact logic that underpins socialism. The idea that the collective good trumps the individual. But one of the things, and you've heard this already this week, that Austrian economics emphasizes precisely individual initiative, the entrepreneur, that is at the center of the market process and at the center of the process of development. So it seems odd then that in trying to bring about development, we are pushing the individual by the wayside in the name of collective goals. In the Constitution of Liberty, F.A. Hayek's book from 1960, he talks about why a constitution of liberty, of private property and individual freedom is important. And he talks about the need to have general and predictable rules such that dispersed individuals can learn what they already don't know. Precisely because we can't know everything ex ante. Again, this is just a variant of the knowledge problem. We need to create institutions such that people have both the capability and the incentive to engage in experimentation to discover what they don't know. That's why Hayek made that argument of general and predictable rules. That's why we need a constitution of liberty. That stands in stark contrast to the collective goals of foreign intervention. So why does all this matter? Well, what I want to suggest is that these parallels foster what I call the unconstrained view of the world, which is basically the fatal conceit. The unconstrained view is that we can do whatever we want. You can accomplish whatever you want to accomplish if you just have the right people and enough resources. Let me give you some specific examples of this. Harry Truman, this is the 4-point speech, 1949, his inaugural address. This is basically the origins of U.S. foreign aid, by the way. All right? We must embark on a bold new program for the improvement and growth of the underdeveloped areas. Who doesn't want that? We all want to help poor countries, right? More than half the people in the world are in misery, food inadequate. All right? They are primitive and stagnant. For the first time in history, we possess the knowledge and skill to relieve suffering. All right? So we know how to do it. It's just a matter of resources. Well, Truman, and I don't know, I'm not a historian, but I think he might be a comedian, because guess what? He was joking. Because he says this, we're going to fix it, and guess what? 5 decades later, Millennium Development Goals, same exact quote, basically. Now we have the knowledge to do it, right? We have the technological knowledge and know-how to realize these goals. We just need willpower. You just got to want it, right? Put a little more elbow grease into it, and we're good to go. Of course, the common sense response to this should be, wait, what about the willpower of the millions of people who tried to help these poor people who were living in misery when Truman was speaking? Lots of people have tried to help. Supposedly we had the knowledge. One explanation is they lacked the willpower, they just didn't want it enough. A more realistic explanation is that they faced perverse incentives and knowledge constraints which prevented them from accomplishing the goals they wanted to. In other words, we really don't have the knowledge. We know what a prosperous society looks like. We don't know how to go about getting it through external central planning. The know what versus the know how. This is the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. This is another favorite quote of the unconstrained vision. Right? He says, look, humanitarian law, what it shows, where there's a will, there's a way. Sounds so nice to say. Right? Where there's a will, there's a way. You can do anything you want. Right? And it's like, well, no, you stand on a cliff and flap your arms, will it all you want, you're probably going to fall to your death. Right? Just not going to work. There are certain things we can't do. And willing it, wanting it, and saying that over and over again doesn't make it come true. The problem with this is it sounds nice, and they'll say, well, it generates excitement, and it points out that we really need to work hard. But it also fosters the unconstrained vision. It pushes by the wayside, rather, the fundamental issues of constraints and knowledge problems, and incentives created by the various institutions that try to carry out these interventions. And that's really what's important in some sense, because we need to understand the limits on what we can realistically design. Most recent example, Haiti. All right, understand the unconstrained vision, which is the dominant paradigm in development and foreign intervention in general, treats the world like a grand science project. We can just fix things. Here you go. All right, Haiti, really bad. Lots of people died, earthquake. Got silver lining. We can fix it the way we want to. Right? We can put it together the way we want to, like all the other development programs in the past failed to do. All right? Now, if you've been following the news, what have you been following? Well, we have trouble like delivering water, setting up tent cities, right? The tents are falling down and stuff. And we're like, no, we'll forget that, right? Why stop at the water, right? We'll rebuild the whole country the way we want to, right? Again, unconstrained vision. So what happens? Well, let me provide you some examples of the unconstrained vision in practice. Make sure I'm all right with time. All right. Turkana, Kenya. This is in northern Kenya. Has anyone heard of Lake Turkana? Or the Turkana, the people? I think there's 350,000 of them. They're nomads, basically. They have livestock that they own, and they travel around with them, and they live off them. All right? They're very poor. All right, some of the poorest people in the world. Lake Turkana, which is part of the region where they live is stocked with fish. All right? And what happens is in Kenya, as you know, it's very hot and there's oftentimes droughts. So what would happen is that these people who are already very poor, when drought struck, some of their life or a lot of their livestock would die, and some of them would die from starvation. So the Norwegian government said, this is a very easy fix. They should fish. All right, there's a lake there. Now, understand also, the unconstrained vision views other people as like dumb. I don't know how else to put it. Right? Because common sense would dictate, if you're starving and you see a lake with fish and you want to fish, you'll do it. Right? But it's like, no, we're going to tell them to do it because they're stupid and they need us to tell them. So the Norwegian government says, well, we're going to fix this. This is an easy fix. All right, we can help these people. All right, what do? This is like in the 70s, I believe this project starts. They go in, they build this beautiful fishing plant. I don't know if fishing plants looks nice as far as fishing plants go. It's a processing plant. I'm sure in Kenya there's not many buildings like this around by this lake. But it's fenced off and closed now. That's not like closing time at 5 o'clock. It was open for 2 days, by the way, and then it shut down. It hasn't been open since. Here's what happens. They send over all their experts. They teach them how to fish. They give them all the latest capital equipment. Boats with motorboats. This is great, right? Motorboats, fishing rods. What else could you want? They train them how to fish. Right? They build them this beautiful plant. They develop a business plan for them. They say, our experts tell us that if you catch this type of fish and process it and send off the fillets, you will make lots of money. Right? They build the plant. It's open for 2 days. It shuts down. All right? What happens? Well, a couple things happen. First is a problem of economic calculation. All right? Which is their business plan forgot that energy costs money. It's very hot in Kenya. Therefore, freezing fish is very costly. Right? Can't afford it. Run out of money very quickly. Second of all, oops, we forgot that we need clean water to carry out this operation. No clean water hooked up. No other complementary goods like infrastructure, like roads, easily accessible roads to transport the fish. All right, these are the practical issues. This is the planning mentality, the expert mentality. I can design a business plan and tell you how to live to improve your life because you're too dumb to figure it out yourself. But then there's a more fundamental question. Let's go back to it. Why weren't they fishing in the first place? Fishing's been around for a long time, right? It's not like the internet, right? So what? That one hypothesis is they're very stupid people. They saw fish swim around, they don't know. Another hypothesis is they realized there were fish there and decided not to catch them. And that was actually what happened. Basically, for the Turkana people, fishing is considered taboo. Now, we might view this as ridiculous. We might say that's the stupidest view ever, right? If I was starving, I would eat squirrel or something like that, right? I wouldn't say it's like taboo. I'd be out there with like a spear trying to get a squirrel, right? Well, it's viewed as basically a sign of poverty because identity and wealth is tied to your livestock. So if you fish, you're viewed as being poor, which is a sign of low status. So most of them didn't want to engage in that. They knew the fish were there. Now, since this project, by the way, some of them have started fishing, some small groups within the larger group, but most of them still don't. This plant sits there today, $150 million for this beautiful picture. Enjoy it, because the Norwegian taxpayers paid for it. Example number 2. How many of you have heard of Marja in the news recently? Why was Marja in the news? Do you know?
Was it the highest death toll for American soldiers? Was that Marja?
At the time. But do you know why? Where's Marja? It's in Afghanistan. And it was in the news a couple months ago because we carried out a major military offensive there. U.S. military along with the other allied troops. Because it was a stronghold of the Taliban. This region, by the way, generates 40 to 50% of the heroin in the world. But if we took a time machine back to the 1950s, you wouldn't know this. Because at the time we had a grand plan to turn the Helmand Valley region, all right, which is down here. No, hold on, I'm sorry, here. All right, it's in the south of Afghanistan, into what was called the Little America. All right, I swear this is not me making this up. This is actually what it was called. All right, and it was a wonderful idea. It sounds so nice on paper. We are going to rebuild. This is very fertile soil here. We're going to rebuild water canals throughout the country to transport water. We're going to forcibly relocate people there to build cities and we're going to build housing for them, right? And they are going to farm with all this stuff and they're going to become wealthy. We're going to basically push them out of poverty, All right? And I'm going to come back to what happened, but fast forwarding, we know what happened, which is the canals, in addition to not transporting water, in theory they could, they serve as very good cover for hiding and shooting at people, right? Which is what the canals are used for mostly, cover during fighting. And what's the soil used for? Well, it didn't reign in the golden age of prosperity. Basically, as I mentioned, it reigned in the golden age of opium, right? That's where a very large percentage of the world's opium is produced. 1960, this is a New York Times article. All right, basically, in addition, of course, Afghanistan has always been used like as a political football, right? Because during the Cold War and all that stuff as well. And of course, there's the Soviet invasion. That's when the U.S. ends its involvement with this project. This project actually started like in 1920, I think. The Afghanistan government started it, and then a whole bunch of different development agencies got involved. This 1960 article talks about the following. They call the project a comedy of errors. They didn't, oops, we forgot to take into account that humans actually, they are humans. Meaning they have feelings, beliefs, they act a certain way, they respond to incentives. Right? Oops, guess we shouldn't have done that. It talks about how there's state-of-the-art tractors sitting there, rusting, not being used. How there's all these resources sitting there, not being used. This cuts against, by the way, you should understand, the same thing with the fishing boats. And you can find lots of examples of the state-of-the-art equipment sitting there rusting. It cuts against the unconstrained vision of development as a technological issue. If that was the case, sending state-of-the-art tractors over would be glorious. Right? They'd be like, awesome, I was using like my hand before to scoop dirt. Now I can sit on this thing, pipe around. We're good to go. I'm wealthy. Right? Instead, they're sitting there rusting. Why? Because they can't engage in economic calculation. The complex array of complementary goods that allow us to take advantage of advanced technologies we're missing. Which is why if you read World Bank reports, going back to like the 50s, all right, you'll see state-of-the-art equipment, but then no spare parts, no gas, no wheels. These are all complementary goods that you and I take for granted. But without the ability to gauge an economic calculation, planners didn't know. They're like, yeah, just send the tractor over. That's cool. Right? That's all we need because that's what works out here in my backyard in Ohio. So it must work over there as well. Right? But it misses the broader context. The complex array of complementary goods that allow us to take advantage of this. Louis Dupree's an anthropologist. He again reinforces this. The human problem appears as monumental as the magnificent engineering edifices left on the landscape. But without consideration of the human factor, great dams simply make great ruins. And Nick Colither, who's a historian, I forget where he's a historian, sums up this Helmand Valley project as a perfect example of the unconstrained vision. They basically treat it as a science project. I want you to understand the arrogance of this position. Because here, and you can find this repeatedly, all right? We tried this stuff. It fails. And then we say, no, this time we really got it figured out. Right? Compare and contrast the Truman quote and the Millennium Development quote. Right? Now we really got it down. Lessons learned. It's a favorite phrase of those who hold the unconstrained vision. Lessons learned. We're going to learn from our mistakes. Right? By the way, the final USAID report on the Helmand Valley project had like a corny closing line, like, the main lesson, it is costly and difficult for flowers to bloom in the desert. And it's like, all right, that's not only corny, but it's stupid and wrong, right? It's like, no, you can't. Maybe it's the case you can't plant flowers in the desert, so maybe we shouldn't have done that in the first place. If I had to sum up with one slide, my whole presentation, it's going to be the following one. I hope it's the next one. If not, it's build up to a subsequent slide. There you go. All right? This is my entire presentation in one slide. I like to call this presentation, by the way, how to build an entire country in 30 PowerPoint slides, which is what this presentation is. And this is not the actual plan that was implemented in Afghanistan, but it was one that was considered. It's declassified now. I'm not like the WikiLeaks. This is actually publicly available. Basically, the government hired a consulting firm. So imagine like McKinsey Consulting, and they said, design help us with Afghanistan. And you can get this PowerPoint presentation. It starts like, I want to say, like with this box and one arrow. That's slide 1. And then slide 2 is more, and like 30 slides later, you got this. This is the final, this is it. Here you go. We've rebuilt Afghanistan. Think about this. All right, and it's hours of fun. You can sit and trace arrows and try to follow them, so it's like if you're on a long car ride, it's kind of fun. But if you think about it, you've got everything going on here, right? Popular support, right? When this came out, by the way, people were like, this is great. Because in the past, the military just focused like on bombing people, but now they have a very broad view and they're appreciating all the different intricacies. Isn't this wonderful? And it's like, no, not really, right? Because just, again, the know what, know how, just because you say, yeah, popular support's really, really important. Conditions and beliefs. Writing words down on a piece of paper doesn't mean that all of a sudden, like, you got it down, right? Popular support. Insurgents, can't have those. Narcotics, let's get rid of that, right? Got the military and police in here. This is the Afghanistan National Security Force. We got to rebuild that. That's easy. Nope, not really. Government capacity, tribal governance. It's great. All these little fillers. It's ridiculous, right? I don't know how this was ever presented to anyone and they just like didn't laugh like in their face and be like, are you kidding me right now? This is the most ridiculous thing ever. But this is like reality, right? Now, one of the critiques of Hayek is that we have lots of designed orders. All right, there's one reading of Hayek that says emergent institutions, spontaneous orders. Right, that's what's important. But we know from our own daily lives there's lots of designed organizations that we interact with. We're here. This is a designed organization. Someone planned this conference. They centrally planned it. Right? A group of people got together and said, we're going to invite these people. We're going to have there's going to be these steps for applicants to apply. We're going to coordinate schedules, the hotel, and so on. We belong to lots of these things, right? So one conclusion you can come to is, well, Hayek screwed up. He's wrong, right? Because he's saying all this stuff about spontaneous, but it's not like I just wander around, you know, and things just happen. It's like, no, I have plans in my head. I pursue them. Well, it's kind of a misreading of Hayek. Right? And if you read Hayek carefully, what does he point out? Well, in the broader spontaneous order, what Hayek in the Fatal Conceit calls the extended order, basically the institutions of capitalism, there are many designed organizations. There are many. But what he goes on to point out is that those designed organizations are constrained by the broader extended order. The broader spontaneous order provides the constraints in which designed plans and organizations can take place. And precisely because the broader extended order, the spontaneous order that underpins these things, varies from society to society, it also implies that organized institutions that work here won't work in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Haiti, in Kenya. Some of them might, but many of them won't. So keep that in mind. Now, of course, the issue becomes, well, what can we do? And that's kind of where I'll close up, and then we can open up for questions. Here's what I want to suggest. I don't want you to walk away from this talk and think, well, Coyne's just saying we're like helpless. We just wander around. We can't do anything, right? We don't know what's going on. Everything's spontaneous, right? It's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. There's lots of stuff that's planned and designed, but what I want you to appreciate is the broader spontaneous order in which those planned interactions take place. Also, economics can help. Did my mic just go out? Feels like it did. All right, I'm sorry. What we can and can't do. Here's an example. All right? I was going to put it in here, but I'll just say it anyway. Iraq. What's happening in Iraq? We went in, we're trying to build basically a liberal democratic, some variant of a liberal democratic government, market economy, right? Rule of law, effective courts, police, yada yada. You know the drill. Well, how many of you have ever heard of the Doing Business Index put out by the World Bank? Has anyone here ever heard of it? A couple of you. How many of you have ever heard of the economist Hernando de Soto? Okay, so more of you, right? So he gets The Other Path and The Mystery of Capital. There's 2 books, and it's a very straightforward argument. Well, I'm simplifying it down. It's kind of like the public choice thing, so you got to read it. But here's the basic argument. In his home country of Peru, he said, look, it's very poor, but walking around on a daily basis, he saw lots of entrepreneurs, lots of stands, lots of businesses, informal, underground businesses operating. And he said, look, these arguments that, well, Peruvians just lack the entrepreneurial spirit and that's why they're poor, that's not true. Because I walk around and see lots of businesses happening. It can't be that, it's like, that's not, it's like, I like being poor, I'm going to sit here and starve to death. All right? It's like, no, there has to be something else going on. All right, one hypothesis, again, is that they're non-entrepreneurial. They just like to be lazy. Okay. Well, an alternative hypothesis is that the incentives that are being created are such that people don't garner a benefit from being entrepreneurs. And I will talk about this a little bit more tomorrow in my talk on entrepreneurship. But why does this matter? Well, De Soto, what he did in Peru was he opened an institute and he went through opening a business. And he mapped it out. If you ever hear Investor Roadmap, that how it's used now at least, it came out of De Soto's work. He mapped all the different steps to open a business. And he actually, in the Other Path, his first book, he has it in the middle. And it's like to open like a fruit stand legally. You know, it's like 2 years, like 3 years worth of income, right? It's like 200 steps. Right? Now imagine like opening Microsoft. Right? Assuming the corporation laws were there in the first place. I don't know if they are or not. But imagine how difficult that is. If like opening a fruit stand is so difficult. What happens? Forces people underground. All right? So we're not helpless. We know economics. You raise the cost of behavior, you get more of it. We know entrepreneurship's important. So it seems reasonable that, for instance, if we wanted to spur economic development in Iraq, one thing we can do is spend lots of money, government money in public infrastructure projects. We can have basically stimulus type projects where we hire people for these public work type jobs. Or we can remove barriers to entrepreneurship and let them operate. Well, as of last year, Iraq was ranked 153 out of 183 countries on the Doing Business Index. The US has been in Iraq for a while. It's like, all right, start chopping away the bureaucracy and regulation. That seems like something actually that can be accomplished, right? Instead, it's like, no, we'll just push that by the wayside. We'll go for the bigger. We'll go for the bigger thing, which is like some variant of this. It's like, no, we don't. We go big or go home, right? That's how we do it, right? So we're not helpless. There's lots we can do, but we can only do those things within constraints. James Buchanan, considered one of the founding fathers of public choice, right, 1986 Nobel laureate, what did he point out? Throughout his work, he points out the importance of the status quo. He says when we talk about reforms, we must start from the here and now. There's constraints. Those constraints are existing political institutions, formal institutions, constitutions. They're also informal institutions, historical experiences, belief systems. All of these things constrain what we can accomplish. What does that mean? Again, simply writing things down on a piece of paper or a PowerPoint slide doesn't get the job done, precisely because it neglects the status quo, starting from the here and now. And that's why Buchanan, when he talks about socialism, he's talking about, this is like Pete Becky's lecture yesterday, right? This is related again. I told you to think about all these as flowing into each other. What's really one of the main takeaways of Pete's lecture? Well, exactly what Buchanan said. Recognizing the limits of human reason is as important as recognizing the potential that might be achieved within those limits. Instead of just writing down our ideal, a starting point should be, let's talk about what we actually can accomplish. And as I pointed out, in many cases, that will be a humbling experience. Maybe we can't put Haiti together back like a puzzle. What empirical evidence do we have of that? I don't know. Maybe the last 3 or 4 decades of attempts to do it. All right? Maybe we should start with figuring out how to get them food and water. And then once we got that down, then maybe we can like go to the PowerPoint slide. All right? And that's what I want you to keep in mind. This idea of constraints and limits on human reason. I'll stop there and we can open up and I can talk about any open questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I figured this would often be the first question, so I was going to ask it. What about Japan?
Japan and Germany, you're talking about World War II, post-World War II, Japan and Germany. In my book, I have a chapter on this. These are the standard cases of success that people point to for nation building. I should point out first that the arguments I'm making does not mean that foreign interventions can never work. It's not like a 0-1, like they always work or always don't. We have examples of it, of cases of it working, these two being some of them. But I think the answer is right here, and this is the argument I make in my book at least, which is, in addition to a variety of other factors, international wars compared to kind of a humanitarian war, meaning that there was a clear surrender in both cases, and we basically occupied the country, not like we're occupying it now in Iraq and Afghanistan with a light footprint approach, but military government, where it's like you do what we say or you get thrown in jail or I kill you. That's different, creates a different set of incentives. Then on top of it, the argument I make in the book is that basically the occupiers worked within the existing status quo. They basically recognized, and in many cases they actually didn't recognize the constraints. For instance, in Germany, they kept like the Nazi price controls in place well after the war ended, right? The U.S. military occupiers. Ludwig Erhard actually removed them, went behind the back of Lucius Clay, who was the military governor, and removed the price controls. And that's when the economy started picking up. There's been writing by Tyler Cowen. If anyone's interested in this, they can email me. And there's some other historians that have called into question the effectiveness of the Marshall Plan. Because that's another thing you always hear, is that the Marshall Plan, it was a very small percentage of GDP. But even to the case it was effective, it only was effective because certain institutions existed that allowed it to be effective. We know that dumping foreign aid on, and Pete's going to talk more about this in his talk after the next talk, so I won't say too much, but we know that just dumping money on countries doesn't work. And he'll go through the evidence on that. That's a very nutshell, small approach on a very big question, but did you, some?
Yeah, I did first. Okay, when you talk about unconstrained vision, such as extending unemployment for 99 weeks, that's like an example. But it appeals to so many people. When you talk about a constrained vision, for an example, we're not going to extend it to 99 weeks. My question to you is, how do you, present that to where it is favorable? Because I'm not an economist, I'm political science, but it seems that the unconstrained visions, people just, they want it. So how can you promote that to where it is appealing? That's my question.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. And I realize there's a gray area with my use of terminology of constrained and unconstrained vision. So does the employment count? I don't know. Maybe not. I mean, it's a policy within a broader political set of political institutions. I don't know. But putting that aside, your broader point is well taken, which is in many cases, people, whether it's citizens, NGOs, for instance, whatever, they want to do something or they think they can help people. So how do we do this? Well, there's two things. Education is one. And two is creating feedback. Feedback such that people know natural limits on their abilities. In markets, for instance, what do we know as natural limits on your abilities? Well, if I think I can start a business flying off cliffs, where I take people to edge of cliffs and I help them flap their arms and take off, my business probably won't last too long. It's a hard constraint, feedback, right? That's a natural constraint on the limits on what I can accomplish. I misjudged profit opportunities. Those things don't exist in government. So one thing we can do is get certain types of institutions out of certain behaviors, right? Which is the project of constitutional political economy, right? This is James Buchanan's project of constitutional political economy. How do we establish rules in politics, given that we have politics, right? The way it exists to constrain their behavior. Now, that raises a whole other set of issues, which Pete was bringing up last night, right? Which is basically an issue of transition in developed countries, right? Because that's transition. If we wanted to go to a more limited type government, that's an issue of transition. We need constraints, but then there's issues of credible commitment, there's vested interest groups. These are very hard topics. But in theory, at least, that's what you'd want to do. You'd want to place constraints on certain types of behaviors such that people would automatically realize the limits of their abilities, because going beyond those limits would lead to some kind of negative feedback. I know that's not a perfect answer, but best I got right now.
I was wondering if when you thought of an argument that I once heard someone say, citing Answer Olson, namely that foreign intervention could actually be a good thing because it would break social rigidities that are in the end actually
Yeah, this is like the colonization. This was a lot of the arguments behind colonization, right? So for those of you on the other side of the room who didn't hear, the gentleman raised the point that one of the arguments, and I think I haven't heard it associated with Olson, but I've heard the argument. Mansur Olson, of course, was a public choice economist at Maryland, University of Maryland. So the issue is one of, okay, there are basically lock-in effects in other societies. There's inertia, whether it's in political, economic, social institutions, which prevents prosperity or movements in that direction. And can't foreign intervention serve as a shock to the system? It basically shocks the status quo and moves in a different direction. And the answer is, in theory, yes, you could do that. And this actually underpins many of the development efforts that are actually undertaken today, right? The idea that you'll hear things, and Pete's going to talk more about this, the poverty trap. Countries are so poor that they get stuck in this equilibrium where they're poor and they can't get out, so they need a shock, the big push, to push them up. And then once they get to a certain level, they'll take off on their own, right? So he'll talk more about that and the empirical evidence related to that, all right? Well, here's the problem. Even if it's true, the next step then is saying, okay, one possibility is that some of these societies that we see problems in are poor because, or remain poor, or remain in conflict. There's lots of, whatever ills you want to identify because of these rigidities that you're talking about. So we can, in theory, shock them out of it. The next question we want to ask ourselves is, okay, given that potential, let's talk about our ability to actually accomplish the ends. There's two steps. Figuring out what ends you want to accomplish, that's the end goal, but then you have to get there, right? We're here, we have to get to the ends. We got to analyze the means and find out if the means are suitable to achieve those ends. That's what economics is about, right? We take ends as given, and then we analyze the means to see if those means are suitable to achieve the desired ends. Well, for some of the arguments I talked about, I'm very skeptical of the means. For instance, I am quite skeptical about knowing how to allocate resources correctly in order to generate prosperity. I am very skeptical that political institutions, both domestic and foreign in the country we're going to shock, will actually operate in a manner which supports our ends. I'm much more skeptical, given my understanding of and appreciation of public choice, to think that the power will be abused in different ways to benefit certain groups of people at the expense of the basically those who lack political connections. And again, we have empirical evidence of this, namely the several cases or many cases of brutality during colonialization and others. So I've heard that argument too. It's a common one. Yes, sir. Which one, the first one or the other path? The Mystery of Capital, yep.
And I heard this argument from a guy saying that what happened in Haiti as compared to Chile, that it was a bigger earthquake.
That's right.
Like nobody died.
It's like 1,000 people died in Chile, even though it was much higher on the Richter scale. Yep.
So the problem was that the property rights system in Haiti was really
Yeah.
a problem to grow big houses.
That's exactly right.
Prevent yourself from that. So it's going to reverse. What if we, I mean, because of course it's a good argument. I mean, there's an institutional framework that makes societies do better. So what if we go to Haiti instead of doing what we're doing now? Well, I'm not doing it because I'm not from the US. So we go and we just establish a good framework, a good institutional framework. Would that be okay? I mean,
That would be like that. What you're saying is this. This is what you're suggesting. Hold on. That's what you want. But that's now. Let me ask you this. Again, know what, know how. What you said all sounds very nice. If we establish a good institutional framework, by that I'm going to guess you mean private property rights, constraints on government predation. Yeah, it's not. Here's the fundamental problem, though. This idea of if we just go over there and establish good institutions, I don't know what that means. Because I don't know how to do that. I know it doesn't entail mailing like the U.S. Constitution over there, right? I know it doesn't involve this. So I know what it doesn't involve, but I don't know. And maybe I'm just not smart enough to figure it out. But I don't know. Now look, but here's the thing, actually. Let me throw this out then. And this goes back to Hayek's point in the Constitution of Liberty, which is we need broad and general and abstract rules which allow people to act freely to discover what they don't know. That includes, by the way, making mistakes. Remember, you've been talking throughout the week about the importance of losses as well as profits. Do you have any idea where, for instance, Chile versus Haiti ranks on the Economic Freedom Index? Yeah, Haiti's like at the bottom, Chile's like pretty high up. There's a reason Chile's wealthier, right? What's their per capita income? Is it like $14,000 a year or something like that? I think Haiti's like $1,200 or something like that, right? There's a reason for that, which is not that we went over there and established good institutions, that good stuff was adopted through a very messy process, and it basically created an institutional environment, like you said, that allowed for people to engage in economic transactions, which then generated wealth, which I agree. Basically what you're saying, and I agree with your fundamental point, and I want to make this, is that development generally natural disasters, crisis is a matter of economic development. This is empirically true. Wealthier countries are better able to absorb shocks. You can't avoid earthquakes, for instance. They happen. It's not like you're like, I'm Donald Trump, you will not strike me, earthquake, right? It's like, no, if it's coming, right? So what can we do? Well, Donald Trump can build a house where he can like take off. Right? He's like flying around. He's like, now you can't hurt me. Right? And then a tornado comes and like crushes him. So the idea is one of wealth. When you're wealthier, you can afford disaster preparation, disaster response. You can have a buffer such that you can have the stupidity associated with FEMA and Hurricane Katrina. Right? I'm not saying we shouldn't try to fix those things, but you can absorb those things better precisely because of the point you're raising. So again, I think it would be very nice if we could go over to Haiti and get good institutions. Not going to happen. Isn't like Wyclef Jean running for president? That'll be good. We'll have like good musical concerts or something like that. Yeah. That's better than Bill Clinton, though, who's like the de facto. What's he doing reconstructing Haiti, by the way? Anyone wonder that? You know, he was like in charge, basically, of it for some odd reason.
Given your framework, what would your policy recommendation be to Obama in Afghanistan?
Get out.
Just find out as soon as possible? Or?
You know, which takes months, by the way. Right? I mean, this is one of the things people didn't realize was even his promise, which of course has been broken, of getting out he couldn't have really kept it, because you know it's not like you just pick up one day and you're like, all right, you know, put the wings out on the tanks and let them fly away. It's like it takes a long time to get all the. I mean, the amount of stuff over there will take, like I've seen estimates 6 months on the low end, up to a year just to get the stuff out, like the capital I'm talking about, to disengage basically. But look, even Iraq, when they're going to draw down he's going to cut troops in half by next August. Is that correct? That pull out 50,000 troops. I might be off, but I know it's 50% of whatever number there is. Still going to be half those troops left. The U.S. will be giving foreign aid. You know, I mean, for instance, the U.S. still had military troops like in Japan and Germany until we got into Iraq, and then we needed those troops. It's like, why are they there? Are they on vacation or something? I don't know what they're doing over there. But you know, which is another thing. Once military bases are established, they usually tend to last for long periods of time. You see that even within the United States when they try to shut down military bases, right? It turns into a huge political battle. Look, I mean, what are the goals in Iraq and Afghanistan? That's what I want to. The question I want you to think about. If the things like establishing democracy, spreading democracy, they're off the table now. Now we're like concerned about minimizing violence, right? Which is very different from the first goal. You know, it's a tough thing. It's very tough once you get involved in these things to pull out, precisely because there'll be a cost to doing it in terms of, you know, people are going to die. They're dying now over there. They're going to continue to die. And you know, doing a cost-benefit analysis of war obviously is very difficult because you have to weigh counterfactuals and these very complex things that are just very difficult, precisely because of the reasons we've discussed. But they're both lost causes. They're drains. You know, by the way, this goes back to Adam Smith. This isn't like me, that wars are like drains on the public finances of the country carrying them out. You can find this in Adam Smith. And he talks about how basically politicians will basically borrow now, push expenses off into the future, and if you keep doing this with war, you're going to overextend the budget. So it's not a novel idea to me. It's also common sense.
How do you feel international law and American law and regulations where companies that want to do business in third world countries and cannot actually bring in their capital, cannot charge pay the labor the amount that they would pay, and actually work in type of a framework that they would have worked if there was no regulations upon them?
Sure. I'm going to punt on this question now because I don't have an answer, which I do, but this is like Pete's talk, basically, and then he'll get mad at me because I'll steal all his thunder.
So I'll ask for that.
It's a development question. It's a very good question. So do ask. It's very important, and I just don't want to. I want to make it exciting for you. Now you can sit there and wonder how he's going to answer. Yes, sir.
The problems of incentives and the information problems within bureaucracy. The ideas of market-based management are able to transcend those problems.
Okay, market-based management. So the question was, given the problem of incentives, and what else did you say? Information problems within firms. Within firms, does market-based management work? So just a quick background for those who are unfamiliar with this. As I mentioned, firms are a form of bureaucracy within a broader market setting. So firms have a residual claimant, they're profit and loss, so they're different than government agencies, but they're organized as hierarchical bureaucracies, which means they are not subject to market conditions within the firm. Right? There's no property rights like over this desk. And I'm like, oh, cool, I want the office, I'll pay you right? If we really wanted to allocate resources, you'd be like, okay, I want that laser printer, I'll pay more, and you can have like the inkjet or something like that. I don't know, whatever, right? Instead, it's like, no, you get this. Someone's central planning it. So this concept of market-based management, this is how Charles Koch runs Koch Industries. Science of Success is his book, where he discusses these principles. And the idea is that he has tried to take these various concepts from Hayek, from Mises, from Kerzner, and introduce them into the way he manages the firm. So he's attempted to take market principles and introduce them into certain aspects of how he runs the firm. All right, it's still a hierarchy even with this in there, right? It's not like he says, just go out there and we'll see how it goes. Right? It's like, no, I'm in charge still. Do I think they can work? In some instances, I think they can work. I think a lot of it depends on the type of, I'm not an organizational specialist, so take this with a grain of salt. It's basically my opinion, is basically what I'm telling you. So discount it however you will, you won't hurt my feelings. It can work to a degree in certain settings. I don't know how transferable it is across firms, though. And that's if you read reviews of Charles Koch's book, The Science of Success, when it says, okay, these things work in Koch Industries, but it's unclear how that they could be transplanted tomorrow, at least to Microsoft, because of pretty much what we talked about, the status quo, right? Firms have their own culture, their own organization. And in some things that work in some firms, if we really want to take the market principles and this idea of spontaneous order and apply it consistently, think about each firm as a little entity unto itself. And in some sense, it's no different than a little country, if you want to think about it that way, right? And something that works in firm X may not work in firm Y. And really what you need is discovery what works in your firm and what doesn't. So do I think those same principles, do I think the core principles of economics apply, which is really what he's doing? Yes. Do I think it is efficient to apply them in all cases? No. I mean, there are like transaction cost explanations for the firm, which is having markets is too costly, so you basically opt out of them. That's one explanation for why firms exist. In that case, we don't want markets. Maybe markets aren't the most efficient thing. Right? You don't have to have markets in everything. Like having markets in your family might be odd. You're like, Junior, if you want Captain Crunch, pony up. He's like, Dad, I have 50 cents. I'm like, well, looks like you're going to have to eat this, the generic brand for a little while until you save up. Yes, sir. Abner Greif, you talking about?
Yeah.
Yep.
He described the creation of market institutions in India. But nevertheless, market institutions have developed also in Asia. But are there any cultural traits that are essential to the creation of
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time? I followed you up to any what?
cultural traits?
Oh, cultural traps. Trends? Characteristics, traits. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry.
Essential for market institutions.
Yeah, all right. Well, Adam Smith has the natural liberty, what he calls natural liberty, which is basically a respect for private property rights and constraints on government. So that's one way to think about it. I mean, this is a very difficult issue. Okay, so by the way, for the people over here who didn't hear, the question was, are there any common cultural traits that are kind of necessary for markets to emerge? Am I market institutions? Is that accurately? Okay. And the answer is, well, look, yes and no. You can't have markets if the culture is you can walk around and bash everyone over the head and take their stuff anytime you want, right? You can't have. No one's going to trade if I have, if the cultural norms are such that people just take what they want by force. So that's like an obvious example, right? But outside that, we don't really, as economists, we have the first order principles. That's how I like to think about them. We know private property rights in the broadest sense are important. Rule of law, constraints on government. We do not have and I'm talking about economists when I say we do not have a very good idea about the specific conditions how to go about getting them. Now, people have tried. They've tried to measure culture. They've tried to come up with some kind of, using case studies, but also empirical, like survey type things, to measure cultural characteristics. There's been studies done on religion to see how that influences it and influences development and growth. And we just don't have a good idea. And it's not like I'm trying to avoid your question. I don't have a good answer for it. And that's why I think I'm so skeptical about efforts like this, because we just really don't know. We know in very broad swipes what's required. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty, it's not like I can say, if you have these 3 traits, you'll have markets, but if you have these 2, you won't. But I can make, again, very very broad claims, which is societies where the culture is such, and again, culture itself is a very complex issue, but when societies where beliefs are such that you just take stuff when you want it, or that earning wealth, right? There's some, you can read about some societies, they're poor, where if you earn wealth, you have an obligation to the community to give it to them, right? Zero incentive to produce, right? Or become wealthy because you don't internalize the benefits of it, right? So I know that society is not going to become wealthy. I can make that claim. But do I know how to fix it? No. Again, I can say, look, as long as you do this, you're going to be poor. So if you like that, if that's your preference, that's okay. But that's really all I can say. Ask Pete that one too. Yep.
Do you think this fatal conceit also applies to interventions that are intercommon with
Yes. I think. Look, the way the complex development industry is, it's basically came out of socialism. That's where a lot of it came out of, right? The way that modern day development economics. I mean, these views of the linear progression of development, that you have to go through certain stages in a linear order to develop, that you need a big push, you need, and Pete's going to talk more about this in his development talk, that you need import substitution, where you basically essentially plan impose protectionism. So instead of importing things, you basically put up walls and produce it yourself. It's like an infant industry type argument. I mean, all of these things are just forms of the fatal conceit. Structural adjustment loans. So you give a loan to a country and say you have to reform your government. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, more structural adjustment plans. I mean, I'm thinking specifically with Ghana, but the things that kind of implemented policies that we would generally see as being favorable.
Like the Washington Consensus type thing?
Exactly.
All right, again, I don't want to step too far in Pete's toes here. Washington Consensus idea is a list of free market policies. And actually, I'm going to stop in a moment because I really don't want to. He's going to be talking about this, and you're going to hear the same thing again. And he'll talk about why the Washington Consensus doesn't work. It's going to be this issue of the know-how and know-what, which is, if you read the Washington Consensus, it's very nice things we all agree on, like private property rights, government constraints, no corruption. But actually transforming that into reality is not as easy as handing someone a list of 10 things. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just, I liked on the last slide, you had a line that said something about, you're not helpless to improve.
Yeah.
To what degree, it seems to me like there's, a lot of disagreement between Republicans and neoconservatives and libertarians on, a lot of them would, agree on that, but they would draw the line.
Sure.
Where would you draw the line in terms of what would be successful? I mean, because obviously it has worked. I mean, there have been places, some smaller countries in Latin America, where it has worked. How do you draw that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't have a good answer. So the question was, for those who couldn't hear it, if you're on this side of the room or up front, was this first one about being helpless to improve the world, and it's kind of a gray area, basically, was the question, which is, even within political parties, the Republicans, for instance, right? I think that's the example you used. There's different degrees of how much we should intervene, right? So where do we draw this line? And my answer is, I don't know. I don't have a firm answer, and I realized, like I was saying before, I realized the grayness of the rhetoric I'm using. But I will say this. I will say that, again, recognizing this Buchanan point, right? He in this article, this is in the collected works James Buchanan, and he's talking about after the collapse of socialism. He points out that just recognizing that there's constraints at all would be a huge win. Think about those quotes I put up, think about things you hear on TV. Very rarely do people actually talk about constraints on achieving things. So I think that in itself, if we could actually have this discussion about where that gray line is, I think that would be a big win in itself. And I know that doesn't answer your question directly, but here's my view on this. The more complex things get, the harder it's going to be to do it. Because the problems I've talked about in terms of the knowledge problems, the requirements of knowledge to fix things, and the magnitude of the intervention, the bureaucracy, the number of political parties. When I say parties, I mean Democrat, Republican, I mean groups, domestic, foreign, vested interest, they're going to expand. I become increasingly skeptical as I move out from smaller things like reducing the number of business interventions to establishing an entire system of private property rights. Right? Again, I realize I'm picking two broad extremes, but I'm trying to highlight the point that as things move from relatively simple to relatively complex, the magnitude of the issues I'm discussing become increasingly broad, which means I become more skeptical of them. I actually think that, as I mentioned before, and this is my view, okay, this is my opinion, But I think that if you understand economics, you err on the side of humility, which is, when we have these discussions, I think we should be humble. One of the things I've never understood about neoconservatives, by the way, is they're so skeptical about, one time I'll never forget, one of the, Pete was there for this, Gordon Tullock, one of the founders of Public Choice, we had a gathering, and he knows like all this stuff about like Agent China and stuff, and he would always bring up like counterexamples. I have no clue what he's talking about. So I'd like be giving these talks, and he'd be like, how do you justify China and this year? I'm like, I don't know, Professor Tullock. I don't know anything about that. I like Chinese food, and I'd like to visit someday. And then he'd say, well, you should look into it. And then my best response ever was, well, you should look at the collected works of Gordon Tullock, because you talk about all these constraints. So why are you so... I'd say, Professor Tullock, if I said you government should plan the shoe market, would you say yes? And he'd say, no, of course not. And I'd say, why are you so confident then that like you can go over, not just create a shoe market, but the foundations of like lots of different markets, right? That's a lot harder than like planning the number of shoes. Right? So that's how I tend to think of these things. As you push out into the complexity, I become increasingly skeptical that you're actually going to be able to accomplish these things. And oftentimes when I have these discussions, it's very funny. When I usually present my book, in the end of my book, I talk about free trade and how we should have unilateral free trade, the U.S. as a means of promoting prosperity, but also change. Because trading with people, in addition to being statically efficient, meaning you reallocate resources to the most highly valued use, is also dynamic, meaning you create new opportunities, you exchange ideas with people, how to do business, and so on. And it's always funny because more people on the left love the anti-war type argument, but they hate the free trade argument. And then the people in the audience who are on the right, like the neoconservative types, they hate the anti-war argument, but then they love the trade argument. So it's like a weird mix in a way. And of course, I am logically consistent throughout, so I'm right. Yes?
There are cases where governments ask for protection from the U.S., for instance. They ask for foreign intervention, and I'm thinking about ethnic conflicts like in Kosovo or post-Soviet republics asking for protection from Russian imperialistic conditions. Cases in Georgia with South Ossetia and Abkhazia or Moldova, which was are these legitimate or
I mean, when you say legitimate, excuse me. The question was, there are many countries that have asked for U.S. Military protection intervention for ethnic conflicts. You mentioned Bosnia, right? Kosovo, yeah. And the question was, are these legitimate? Now, by legitimate, I mean, I don't know if you mean legally legitimate, like under international law, or do you mean are they? What's the?
Legitimate in the sense of are they any good?
I mean, they're good. Look, I mean, we have the best military in the world, meaning that we can basically destroy anything we want, and it's true, right? What's the military supposed to do, right? The military has a comparative advantage in blowing stuff up. They're very good at it, right? So if the goal is to blow stuff up and protect people by blowing stuff up, then yeah, that's good, right? When it moves beyond that into, right, and I have these quotes, I don't have them in this presentation, but the counterinsurgency manual for the U.S. military, not just protecting people, it's fostering markets, rebuilding infrastructure. I'm look, they have a comparative advantage in shooting M16s. That's what they have a comparative advantage in doing, not spurring economic development, right? So when you move beyond a certain thing, right? So there's a normative goal or normative end. Should we intervene or not? That's outside the scope of what I'm talking about. I'll leave that up to the philosophers, the international lawyers, if it's legitimate, all that stuff. And I'm not saying those issues are unimportant. I don't know enough. But I will say this. Again, military is good at blowing stuff up. I will say this. In Somalia, for instance, the Somalia disaster started as a peacekeeping mission, right? But we can use incentives to analyze that as well, which is what happened in Somalia. We went in as peacekeepers and we were neutral. We weren't picking sides, we were delivering food. But guess what? If you and I are fighting, Troy and I are fighting, and you give Troy food, and you're I'm neutral. And I'm no, you're not. You're helping my enemy, right? So I turn around and shoot at you. And now you have a decision. You can stand there and say, I'm neutral. I'm getting shot, right? Or you can shoot back at me, right? Very quickly, these things unravel and expand typically into much broader things. And that's when I become skeptical. Bosnia and Kosovo, they're difficult cases because there's the conflict part, but then there's the state building and nation building part. In both cases, it's unclear to me that they've succeeded on that margin in becoming self-sustaining states, meaning that they're heavily dependent on external aid and also governance in order to sustain. And maybe that's the best that can happen there. I don't know. I think I'm out of time, right? Thank you all very much.